On the third morning, Ruben Cordero put a bucket down into the stock tank and brought it up the color of coffee with too much milk in it. He held it a while. He wasn't looking at it. He was doing arithmetic in his head, and the arithmetic was going somewhere he didn't want to follow. 300 and some people in that town. Every last one of them had been drinking off a railroad tank car since the day the place was surveyed. The car came Tuesdays. It was Friday. A man in his trade knows the numbers without working them. A person needs about 3 quarts a day to keep breathing in that heat, and that's before you boil a bean or wash a face. A horse wants 10 times that. There were more horses on that street than people, and there was one pond, 3 miles out on Avila's south section, with 140 head of cattle standing in it since May. Cordero was a windmiller. That was a real trade out there, and it had its own name, and it sat next to another one. The driller came first, worked mostly alone, followed the fence crews and guessed at the ground, and bored his hole with a rig a horse walked in a circle to turn. Then the windmiller came behind him and set the mill on top. Men in that line lived in covered wagons and saw a ranch headquarters maybe twice a month. Cordero did both jobs, which was less common and paid better. He had never in his life been afraid of water. 9 days later, he had that pond running out of a barrel clean enough to read the bottom of the glass through. 11 people in that town went down on their backs and stayed there. So this is the story of a town that drank a cattle pond and lived, and of the 4 days when the man who saved them was the most hated man on that street. The mistake he made is the useful part. It isn't a careless one. It's the one you'd make standing right where he stood. Tanaja took its name from a basin in the rock that a Spanish outfit had watered at long before anybody laid a rail through there. A tanaja holds rainwater in stone for weeks after the country around it has gone hard. By 1910, this one was a dry dish with a sotol bush growing out of it, and the name had quit being funny some years back. The town sat where it sat because the railroad wanted to stop, and the ground was flat. Nobody could get a well in. Cordero himself had put 4 holes down inside the section line and brought up nothing you'd give a mule. Gyp water, bitter, ran a man through in an afternoon. Below that, the drill found rock and stayed in it. So the water came the way the flour came, and the nails came. On the train, in a tank car, and out of the car into barrels standing along the platform with boards laid over them. You bought it by the barrel. That was ordinary. A dozen towns out there lived that way, and up in the Panhandle, there'd been a town buying it at 20 cents the barrel out of casks lining the track until somebody finally got a tower built. Here's the part that sat badly with people once they had time to think about it. The railroad had water. The railroad had had water for 30 years. When the first lines came through that country in the 80s, the very first thing they built, before depots, before anything, was windmills. Great wooden-wheeled eclipse mills, some of them 22 feet across, the biggest machines of their kind anybody made. Because a steam locomotive can't run without a boiler full, and the company was not about to be at anybody's mercy for it. So the railroad had solved this problem for itself in 1881. The town it created never did. Hollis Mabry was the agent, and he was not a bad man, which is inconvenient. He wore his collar buttoned in 104 degrees, and he'd stood on that platform 11 years. The car stopped coming in the first week of July. Mabry never once lied about it. Every morning he came out with the same news and stood there while people took it off him. Water's wanted up the line. Engines can't run dry. Should be a car Tuesday. And nobody in Tanaja could argue with it, which made it worse. In a dry year, the railroad has exactly the water it has, and it will put that water in a boiler before it puts it in a barrel, because a stopped railroad is a dead railroad, and every man on those boards knew it. They weren't fighting a villain, they were fighting a schedule. "Should be a car Tuesday," Mabry said. He said it 4 Tuesdays running. Cordero was not from there and hadn't meant to stay. He came in June to set a tower on the Poe place, and the drought caught him mid-job with a half-built windmill and no water to prove it with. That's the whole of the man's history worth having. 29, been at wind machines since he was 17, could read ground the way some men read weather, and couldn't leave a broken thing alone. By the second week, people had started counting out loud, which is always the sign. Now, you want to know what the counting sounded like. Not dramatic, small and steady, and it went on all day. How much is in the Warner barrel? How much did the Ybarra place draw yesterday? Whose turn is the trough? The ugliest number in that town wasn't about people at all. A grown man in that heat needs 3 quarts to drink. A saddle horse standing in a shed wants 6 or 7 gallons and will tell you about it. Then there were the freight teams and the milk cows and Avila's remuda out on the flat. One horse drank what 10 people drank, and you couldn't shoot a horse because the horse was how you got out. Orrin Petty solved it the way a druggist solves things. He had a case of bottled table water in the back, shipped in for people with delicate stomachs, and by mid-July he was selling it a bottle at a time at a price he'd have been ashamed to say out loud in June. He wasn't a swindler. He believed in his bottles, having read the label on them, and in a small town, that's most of what a man has to go on. Paulina Ibarra ran the boarding house at the end of the street with 9 people under her roof, counting her sister's boy, Silvano, who was 12 and useless in the specific way 12-year-olds are useless. On the 18th, she quit taking boarders. Then she went out to the shed and started washing barrels. Nobody asked her why she was washing barrels she had nothing to put in. The pond wasn't a pond. Out there they called it a tank, a scraped dirt basin about the size of a church, put in by Trinidad Avila's father with a slip scraper and 4 mules, sited where the caliche came near the surface so the water would sit on the hardpan instead of going down through it. That's a good piece of work, and it did exactly what it was built to do. It caught what came off the rock in May and held it. It also held whatever 140 cattle do while standing in water in July. Cordero rode out with Silvano on the 20th, and they walked the edge of it. Neither said much. The water was warm as a tub of wash water. There was a rim of dried scum a foot wide all the way round where the level had dropped, and it crackled under a boot like paper. Silvano asked if people could drink it. Cordero said people had drunk worse, which was true and wasn't an answer, and the boy knew it. Cordero had a reason to believe he could fix this, and the reason was a good one. He'd read it in a paper a few years back, and it stuck the way a fact sticks when it's about your own trade. Cities back east had been burying people to typhoid for a generation. Then they put in sand filters, and the burying stopped. Not slowed, stopped near enough. He remembered the shape of it, if not the figures. Some city where the fever came down by 2/3 the year the filter bed went in. He wasn't wrong. Those numbers are real. Albany, New York was losing something like 85 people a year to typhoid, and the year after the filtration plant opened, it lost 24. Chicago's rate fell from 159 per 100,000 to 46. Around 1900, water was killing about 1/4 of everybody who died of an infection in an American city, and then filtration arrived and it simply quit doing that. Ruben Cordero had the whole fact and none of the order. What he built out of what Tinaja had. 2 hogsheads from behind the saloon, 60-odd gallons apiece, scrubbed out and then burned out with a straw fire to take the whiskey off the staves. A bung drilled low and a wooden spigot driven in. Gravel off the right-of-way in the bottom, coarse sand over the gravel, and over that fine sand hauled from a draw 2 miles south. On top of the fine sand, charcoal. He and Silvano made it themselves. You burn mesquite down to a bed of coals, shovel dirt over the whole thing to choke the air off it, and leave it a day and a night. What you dig out in the morning is black and light and rings when you drop it. Then you break it small. Ahead of the barrels he set settling tubs, and that part he got dead right. You don't put mud through a filter. You let it stand a day, let the heavy stuff quit, and draw off the top. It took him 9 days, and nobody watched him do it. No crowd on the bank, no committee. 1 man, 1 boy, and a shovel, and a town 3 miles off that hadn't come out to look. Underneath all of it sat the fuel problem, and it never went anywhere. That country has no wood. What it has is mesquite, and mesquite is mostly underground. The tree you can see is the small half of the plant. A grown mesquite will put a taproot down 40, 50 feet hunting water, which is the whole reason it survives out there and the whole reason it's murder to dig. To burn it, you grub it, which means going after a root system the size of a wagon with a mattock in July at 106 for maybe an armload of good burning wood by dinner. Silvano grubbed mesquite most of that month. His hands went to pieces. Paulina wrapped them in strips off a flour sack, and he went back out. Hold on to the fuel. Everything after this happens because fuel cost more than water did. On the 9th day, Cordero drew off the first bucket from the second barrel and carried it up the street to the platform, where about 20 people were standing around, not talking to Mabry. He set it on the boards. You could see the grain of the wood through it. 4 hours earlier, it had been in a cattle pond, and now it looked like something you'd pour for a guest. A woman started crying, which embarrassed everybody, including her. Somebody asked what it tasted like. Cordero said nothing, and meant it as an answer. Charcoal will take the taste out of nearly anything, which is why it sat in every household water filter sold that decade, and which is a fact that ought to worry you more than it worried them. 2 of the Warner children were drinking it by noon. First one down was a section hand named Ostrand, and nobody connected it to anything, because a man off a track gang gets sick, and that's Tuesday. Then the 2 Warner children, then Wiley Poe's wife, then Poe himself, then a boarder at the Ybarra place, and then the boarder in the next room. By the first week of August, there were 11 people in that town who couldn't stand up, according to the count Paulina kept on the back of a feed bill, because somebody had to. It came on slow, which is the ugly part. Nothing that knocks a man flat in a night, a week of feeling wrong, and then a fever that climbs and stays climbed. And then comes the part the families remembered, which is that the person stops being entirely there, not asleep and not awake, answers you a beat late, or answers a question you didn't ask. It has a name in the old medical books, and the name is honest. They called it the typhoid state. The Q at the barrel is the thing to look at, because it happened twice in the same spot, and it looked nothing alike. That first week there was a line by 7 every morning, and it was cheerful the way a line is when everybody standing in it has just stopped being frightened. People brought their own pails. Somebody worked out an order without anybody appointing them to do it, and they made room at the front for the Rand woman because she was slow on her feet. The second time there was no line. 1 man at a time, at odd hours, filling fast and going back up the street without stopping to talk to anybody. And there was a stretch in the middle of August when the barrel stood open all day, and nobody came down to it at all. And Cordero sat beside it from morning to dark, making sure that nobody did. Whether it was typhoid, I can't tell you, and neither can anybody else. The nearest doctor was 40 miles off, and no paper from that summer survived. What we've got is what they had. The ones who drank most got worst. The children got it hardest, and it started after the barrels started. I'm not going to give you a number for how many died. I don't have one, and one I made up would be worth nothing to you. What I can tell you is what that illness did in those years, before there was anything to treat it with. It ran about a month, and better than 1 in 10 of the people who took it didn't get up again. Cordero worked it out on about the 4th day, alone, standing at his own barrel with a glass in his hand. The water was clear. He'd made it clear. He'd been proud of it. And clear was the whole of what he'd made. He had taken the mud out of that pond, and left everything the mud had been hiding, and then he'd handed it up and down the street in buckets, and people drank it gratefully because it looked like what they used to buy off the train. He had taken away the fear and left the disease. He said none of that to anybody. He shut the barrels, which put the town back on a dry pond and made him, for 4 days, the most hated man in Tanaha. He had 3 weeks of August in front of him, and no idea yet what he'd missed. There were 2 things. He'd figure out the first one in a kitchen, from a woman who couldn't explain it. The second one nobody in 1910 knew, and most people don't know it now. He went to the Ibarra place on the night of the 5th, because Silvano was there, and Silvano was one of the 11. The boy was in the back room. He was going to be all right, though nobody in that house knew it yet. Paulina had him on broth and hadn't been to bed, and she had a fire going in August, on mesquite that had cost her nephew his hands, and on the fire a kettle. Cordero stood in the door a while. Then he asked her what water she'd been giving the boy. He said afterward that he asked it stupidly, the way you ask a thing you should have asked in July. "Mine," she said. 9 people under that roof, not one of them sick except the boy who'd been out at the pond and the barrels every day. So he asked what she did to it. Here's where people expect the old woman to explain something. She didn't. She was tired, and he was in her doorway, and she answered him the way you'd answer somebody asking why you put the left boot on first. She boiled it. She'd always boiled it. Her mother boiled it, and her mother's mother in Coahuila boiled it. And there had not been one day in her life when water came into that kitchen and went to a person without going over a fire first. And before the fire, she cut up a nopal pad and dropped it in the barrel overnight. And by morning, the muck was on the bottom, and what stood above it was fit to work with. Cordero asked why the nopal. Paulina Ibarra said, because otherwise the water is dirty. That was all of it. She had no theory. She knew what her mother had done, and she'd never once had a reason to stop. He asked one more thing before he left, and it's the question that tells you what kind of man he was. He asked her how long she'd been doing it since the train quit. She said, since the train quit. He asked how much wood that took. She showed him the yard. There was no fence on the north side of that lot anymore. She'd burned it in the 3rd week of July and hadn't mentioned it to anybody. Cordero went out and sat on her step for a long time and didn't go home. So here's the physics, and there's more of it than you'd think, and none of it is hard. 4 steps. The answer is the order. Что убирает каждый? Standing water off a dirt tank carries 2 different things, and people mix them up their lives. There's dirt, clay, silt, ground-up cattle track, and there's what's living in it. Overnight in a still barrel drops the heavy dirt to the bottom for free, on nothing but time. It doesn't touch the living part at all. The nopal, which is the good one. The dirt that won't settle is the fine stuff. Particles small enough to hang there shoving each other apart, staying up for weeks. That's what makes a tank look like coffee. A prickly pear pad is full of a slick, gluey substance called mucilage. Cut the pad and it runs. In a barrel, that mucilage is a long, sticky molecule that reaches out and takes hold of those floating particles and bridges one to the next until they aren't small anymore. They're a clump. A clump falls. This isn't folklore that turned out to be charming. Engineers study it on purpose. A group at the University of South Florida has spent years on cactus mucilage as water treatment for places that can't afford chemicals, and it holds up. Drops turbidity about as well as the industrial coagulants and forms its clumps faster than alum does. Takes some bacteria down with them. Takes out some arsenic. But hear what it is. It puts the dirt on the floor. It doesn't disinfect anything. Paulina's barrel gave her clear water, and clear was never why her house stayed well. Слизь связывает эро. Комок падает. Now the sand, and this is where Cordero went into the ditch. A slow sand filter is one of the best pieces of water technology anybody ever built. It is also almost entirely alive. The sand isn't what kills. What kills is a thin, greasy layer that grows on top of the sand after the filter has been running a while. Bacteria, fungus, protozoa, a whole population sitting up there eating what comes through. The Germans named it Schmutzdecke, dirt blanket. A mature one takes out 99% and better of what can hurt you. That layer is not there when you build the filter. It has to grow. 10 days, 20 days, sometimes weeks of steady running before the bed is alive. A brand new sand filter is at its most useless on the day you need it most. Cordero's barrels were 9 days old and ran dry between draws. He'd built a filter. He hadn't built a living one. And there's no way he could have known the difference, because nobody explained it to anybody until well after his lifetime. What he had was an excellent strainer. There's a second half to that. A slow filter will only take fairly clean water to begin with. Feed it a muddy tank and you smother the bed. So the nopal isn't an alternative to the sand. It's the step in front of it. And the charcoal on top of his barrel was doing the most dangerous thing in the whole apparatus. It was taking away the taste. Bad water usually announces itself. It smells, or it's brown, or it turns your mouth. Charcoal strips all of that off and hands you back something that gives you no warning at all. And then the fire, which isn't clever at all. Heat. Bring clear water to a rolling boil. Hold it a minute, and the bacteria and the viruses and the parasites are dead. Not reduced. Dead. Today's advice is the same advice word for word. Clear water, rolling boil, 1 minute. 3 if you're high in mountains, which West Texas is not. Boiling won't take out poison, won't take out metal, won't make a bad-tasting water good. It does one job. It happened to be the job that was killing Tinaja. Settle it, clear it, strain it, boil it. Cordero did 3 of those and skipped the 4th, and he didn't skip it out of carelessness. He skipped it because boiling for 300 people meant grubbing mesquite root out of hardpan from dawn to dark with no end to it, and because after 9 days of work he was holding a bucket that already looked perfect. A clean glass and a tired man. That's the whole of it. What happened in Tinaja after the 5th of August wasn't clever. It was work, a great deal of it, and it went 6 weeks. Cordero opened the barrels again on the 7th, and this time the water didn't go to people. It went into a line of kettles and cauldrons and washpots, and 1 copper still that Petty handed over without being asked twice. All of them on trenched fires behind the Ibarra place, and it stayed there till it rolled. Paulina ran that yard. He was better at barrels, she was better at people, and the 2 of them settled it inside a day without discussing it. The nopal came off Avila's section. Old Trinidad Avila had been burning pear since June, which is a thing you'd want to see. In a hard, dry year, the only green standing in that country is prickly pear. Cattle will eat it and do well on it, apart from the part where it's covered in spines. So a rancher takes a gasoline torch, and they called it a pear burner, and men were walking pastures with them all over West and South Texas by then. A farm journal wrote the practice up plain in 1907, and it was old before that. Spanish settlers had been singeing pear for cattle since the 1700s, and the word for it was chamuscando. Avila had kept 140 head alive on burnt cactus for 2 months. Nobody in that town thought of the plant as anything but cow feed and a nuisance in a boot. Cordero asked him for pads, uncut, unburnt. Avila wanted to know what for, got told, and stood there a minute doing what Cordero had done at the barrel, running back through his own life hunting for the place where he'd walked past it. Then he said a thing Cordero repeated for years. I can't give you his Spanish, only the sense of it. I have been burning that off my pasture since I was a boy, so my cows could drink out of a pond. Nobody told me it went the other way. The mesquite came out of the ground. By mid-August, every man in Tinaja who could hold a mattock was on the mesquite, because that was where the whole cost of the thing sat. Not the barrels, not the cactus, which grew free and stood in every direction as far as a man could ride. The fuel. They grubbed roots. They pulled the fence off the old Cade place and burned the posts. They burned the boards off 2 dead buildings. Mabry could have kept his hands clean and his collar buttoned, and instead came down off the platform every evening at 6 and dug with the rest of them, and after that nobody said a word to him about the tank car. Then the part nobody plans for. Boiled water is hot. You cannot hand a man off a section gang at 108 a cup of water at 180 and expect thanks for it. He'll drink it once. Then he starts finding reasons to drink out of the horse trough, and he does it where you can't see him. Paulina lost that argument about 3 days, and then quit arguing and solved it, which is the difference between her and most people. Boiled water went into stoneware crocks. Wet sacking went round the crocks. The crocks went in the shade on the north wall where a little wind came through. Wet cloth in dry air pulls heat out of whatever's under it, and in air that dry, it pulls hard. By evening, that water was colder than the pond had ever been. The stupidest problem of the whole month, and it nearly undid the rest, and it got fixed with a wet sack. The numbers, for what they're worth. Nobody at Tinaja kept a ledger, so what follows is arithmetic and not a record, and I'll say so plainly. A tank car of that period carried 6,000 to 8,000 gallons. On the barest ration, drinking, cooking, a little washing, 6,000 gallons runs 300 people somewhere near 10 days. If they drank it and washed in nothing, 3 weeks, maybe 4. 31 days went by between the last car in July and the first car in September. They filled that hole out of a cattle pond with a cactus and a fire made of roots. The car came on the 8th of September, with no warning at all, which people afterward thought was about right. Mabry didn't announce it. He heard it before anybody, the way a man does after 11 years on a platform, and walked out to the edge of the boards and stood. By the time it was in sight, there were 40 people out in the sun, watching a tank car roll in like it was worth watching. Inside 2 weeks, you could buy by the barrel again and tell yourself, if you had the stomach, that August had happened to somebody else. Nobody in Tinaja made a speech about it. Small places don't. But things got settled anyway, in the way of things left in a yard. Orrin Petty took the bottled water off his shelf and never put it back. He'd sold clean water at 4 times its worth in July, and it had been safe water the whole time, which is the awkward part. His bottles never hurt anybody. What he'd been selling was certainty, and certainty is what the town nearly died of, and he seemed to work out the difference on his own. Wiley Poe came out of his fever in the last week of August, and it was 2 months before he could put in a full day. That's the ordinary way with it. The fever breaks, and then the weakness stays on for a season. And men who'd had it in those years talked about the winter after more than the summer of it. He's the one who made the wet sacking into a proper thing. A shaded rack behind the depot with room for 8 crocks, built for a town that no longer needed it, and it stood there years. Cordero finished the tower on the Poe place in October. Then he went back to the section line and put a hole down in a spot he'd passed over twice. 600 feet, which was deeper than anybody there had paid for before. Hard water, iron in it, tasted like a nail, but it came up cold, it came up steady, and it never once cared what the railroad was doing. They put an air motor on it, 8-foot wheel, $25 out of a catalog, and it turned in the same wind that had been blowing across that town the whole time. The nopal barrel outlasted all of it. 20 years on, in houses in that county where nobody remembered why, women were dropping a cut pad in the water barrel overnight and drawing off the top in the morning. A few of them had it from Paulina Ibarra. Most had it from somebody who had it from her, and by then it was just how you did it, with no theory attached, exactly the way she'd done it. They're running the same trick through laboratories in Florida right now, with instruments, and writing papers about it. The papers call it a promising low-cost coagulant. In Tinaja, they called it a cactus. There's a photograph that may or may not be of that town, and I'd rather not swear to it either way. 2 barrels on a porch, a woman's arm at the edge of the frame, and on the boards between them, a prickly pear pad cut open and going brown in the sun. Nobody who took that picture thought it was a picture of anything. Cordero rode east the next spring, and where he went, the trouble ran the other way. Too much timber, water in every draw, and a family that walked up into the Appalachian ridges in October to bring their stock down and came out on the wrong side of the mountain. No compass. 4 days without sun. Nothing to steer by but the trees. But that's a story for another night.